Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us for UEA's 2024 Lasdun Lecture, Menopause for All. This is going to be given by Prof Anne-Marie Minihane, who's been a colleague of ours since I joined UEA, and I'm really looking forward to this talk. We had a wonderful turnout here in the audience. It's one of the least gender-balanced audiences I've seen for some time, but it's wonderful to see you all. And we obviously have a very large audience joining from the globe via live stream. So I'm Charles French-Constant. I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Medicine and Health Sciences, and today's event is done in collaboration with Health UEA. So Health UEA is our newest interdisciplinary theme, joining Creative UEA and Climate UEA as a way of encapsulating and promoting the world-leading research that we do here at UEA. And so I think this is a tremendously exciting evening for us involved in healthcare, and I hope the first of many such events. So Health UEA, as I said, exists to give a profile to the world-leading research that we do around health, and you're going to hear an absolutely stellar example of that. So please do find a moment to visit the Health UEA website, either after the event or maybe even during it, to actually see some of the amazing things we're getting up to. So, moving on, I'd like to introduce our tonight's esteemed speaker. So Professor Anne-Marie Minihane is, and I'm going to have to read this out, Professor of Nutrigenetics and Head of the Department of Nutrition and Preventative Medicine in our medical school here at UEA. And her long-standing research interests are around dietary components, in particular marine fatty acids and plant bioactives, and also the ApoE genotype that you will have read about recently in the press on cardiometabolic and cognitive health. But a key recent focus has been the whole question of the menopause and cognitive health, and what we can do, what changes one can make in terms of nutrition or other behaviours that we can do to ameliorate some of the effects. And I think it's very fair to say that this is a massively understudied area and clearly one of enormous importance. So just to give you some background for Anne-Marie, she completed her first degree in nutrition and biochemistry at the University of Cork in Ireland, and then moved to the UK to complete her PhD. So before joining Norwich Medical School, she was a reader in integrative nutrition at the University of Reading, and then spent time in Auckland in New Zealand. She has a variety of very prestigious appointments. She's on the board of the directors of the International Society for Fatty Acids and Lipids, deputy and associate editor of the British Journal of Nutrition, Nutrients and Frontiers in Nutrition, and a UK representative on the Federation of the European Nutrition Society, or FENS. So it's an enormous pleasure to welcome you, Anne-Marie, to give this talk today. Thank you very much, and we're hugely looking forward to it.
Good evening, everyone. I must update that photograph. It does me lots of favours. So I'm very pleased to be here, delighted to see all of you, and welcome to everybody who's joining us online. Before I start with the presentation, I'll just ask for a show of hands from anybody if you're affected by the menopause. Okay, keep your hands up. A show of hands for anybody. Add your hand if you're a healthcare professional. Keep your hands up. If you're running out of hands, you can use your legs if you don't damage the person next to you. Put your hand up if you run your own business or you manage people. Okay. And finally, put your hand up if you've got a partner or family member or friend or colleague between the ages of 40 to 60. For people online, I think that's most of us in the room. So the point I'm trying to make is that we're all affected by the menopause. Menopause is something all women go through. It's been the case for time immemorial, but despite the fact that we're all affected by the menopause, there's still a huge taboo around the menopause. And that taboo actually feeds into a huge lack of knowledge and lack of understanding, including amongst women themselves. In a recent survey conducted by My Menopause Centre in the UK, which included thousands of women from the ages of 40 upwards and their partners, the results of the survey were quite striking. So only 1 in 4 women felt or feel they're prepared for the menopause. Half of the women were surprised by their menopausal symptoms, and half of the women felt they were more serious than they were expecting. Only a third of people surveyed knew how to support people through the menopause, and only 17% of the public felt there was enough support mechanisms in place. So I think it's fair to say, even though we're all affected by the menopause, as a society, we could do far better. And we need more knowledge. We need to be more informed, prepared, and supportive of the menopause. So I suppose that's my starting point, and now I'll go on to hopefully provide a little bit of information which will fill some of that knowledge gap, and hopefully you'll take away some bits of knowledge that you didn't come with tonight. So this is what I'd like to cover in the next hour or so. Start off describing what is the menopause and what are the range of symptoms women experience, and then talk about some interventions. There's a lot of misinformation around HRT, so hopefully I'll begin to unpick that a little bit, and also go on to talk about nutrition strategies for the menopause. Now, I have to say, for some of the nutrition strategies, it's more inferring what might be useful, because there's a huge lack of research in this space. Actually, women are underrepresented in medical research in general, or health research in general, but certainly there's very, very little research on what can help this menopausal transition from a health and well-being perspective. And then just a final topic, what can we all do to support the menopause in our lives? So, what is menopause? So the official definition of menopause is when a woman hasn't had a menstrual cycle or a period for at least 12 months. That is preceded by the perimenopausal period, which usually lasts for about 4 years, when estrogen levels being produced by the ovaries mainly begin to drop and begin to get quite erratic, as do the other hormone, progesterone levels. And that kind of erratic production of estrogen causes all kinds of menopausal symptoms. And those menopausal symptoms last for on average 7 years, but for women they range from about 4 to 14 years. And actually what is underappreciated is actually the menopausal symptoms often go far beyond actually the menopausal cutoff itself. So what is kind of the mechanistic basis for the perimenopause or the menopause? So women in their fertile years produce 3 hormones. They're all produced from the precursor cholesterol, estrogen and progesterone in quite high levels, testosterone in lower levels. As I mentioned, as women transition through the menopause, the amount of estrogen produced by the ovaries mainly, but also by the adrenal glands, and some estrogen is produced by adipose tissue, but mainly by the ovaries, the level of estrogen starts to drop, and its production starts to get quite erratic, as does the production of progesterone. The drop in testosterone tends to be more gradual. So this is looking at it graphically. So I think it's fair to say that the hormones get kind of quite chaotic. This is the perimenopausal period, when actually the hormones just start to get really out of sync and erratic. There's no cycle to them, and eventually they decline. And as women come out through the menopause on the other side, the levels are significantly lower than they are in the reproductive years. Now, there's different kinds of menopause, of course. There's the natural menopause, which I've described, which typically happens about age 51, but there's other forms of menopause. There's what's called premature ovarian insufficiency, which is defined as menopause which occurs before the age of 40. And that's often for unknown reasons. So it could be genetic, it could be due to autoimmune reasons, or it could be because the woman has been exposed to some toxin, such as chemotherapy or radiotherapy or a virus or a pesticide. Often the reason actually for premature ovarian insufficiency is unknown. But it is a recommendation that once women suffer from premature ovarian insufficiency, that they go on to HRT for at least a decade, or until the early 50s, when they would have experienced the natural menopause. And then there's what's called the medical menopause, where the menopause has been medically induced. So that can be for the reasons I've just mentioned, which are also the cause of premature ovarian insufficiency, for example, exposure to chemotherapy or radiotherapy. But another reason is what's called bilateral ovarectomy. So the ovaries have been removed. And the reason for that can be things like ovarian cancer, or it can be prophylactic. So the ovaries are taken out, for example, if you've got a genetic predisposition to ovarian cancer, they may be taken out as a precaution. Also, if you've got a growth or a benign cyst in your ovaries, or you've got what's called pelvic inflammatory condition, and often the cause of that is inflamed ovaries. So there's kind of lots of reasons why the ovaries are removed, but of course this induces menopause. And it induces a medical menopause. So the symptoms. The symptoms are many. And they come in all kinds of combinations and permutations. So typically women suffer from 7 symptoms or more. 80% of women suffer symptoms. 20% seem to get off relatively free of symptoms. 25% of women have very significant symptoms. And 10% of women have symptoms which are so significant that they leave the workforce. Now, this is particularly important for certain sectors. So 83% of our teachers are female, 81% of people working in social care are female, 77% of the NHS are female. So for particular sectors, this is hugely problematic, in addition to the women themselves. So the most common symptom of menopause is what we call vasomotor symptoms. We call them hot flushes in the UK. For some reason, they call them hot flashes in the US. They're the same thing. And a hot flush usually lasts about 4 minutes, typically. Can be experienced any time during the day, and they can be blooming and comfortable. Night sweats are basically just hot flushes which happen at night. And the reason for these is, if you look at the diagram here, there's a particular area of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is kind of the thermoregulation area of the brain, and it's full of estrogen receptors. So once estrogen levels start to decline, then also the functionality of the hypothalamus starts to decline. And the body finds it extremely difficult to maintain core temperature. So our core temperature is really important. It's really important that the body stays between 36.5 degrees and 37.4 degrees. Anything outside that range, the organs start to struggle, metabolism starts to struggle. So if the body starts to overheat, what it needs to do is dissipate heat really quickly, and the blood vessels dilate, and that's what causes hot flushes and night sweats. So they're very common in menopause, and also they're often an etiological cause of sleeping difficulties, which is the most common symptom of menopause. 80% plus of women experience sleeping difficulties as they're transitioning from premenopause to postmenopause. But there's many other symptoms, and they're listed here on the slide. So often women experience skin and hair changes in the composition and where hair grows, and changes in features of their skin. Weight gain is really common during the menopausal transition, and there's actually many reasons for that, and there's no one reason. The first reason is, as women age and transition through the menopause, there's kind of a redistribution between fat and lean body mass. Lean body mass needs more energy, fat needs less energy, so your energy needs go down as you transition through the menopause. Also, things like anxiety increase the levels of cortisol, which affect your appetite hormones, things like ghrelin. So when you're stressed, you tend to overeat. It has an evolutionary advantage. It's not so helpful to us anymore. When we have sleep difficulties, we tend to favor fat and sugary foods. And the other reason why we tend to put on weight during the menopausal transition is it's kind of a time of life that's very busy for women. There's caring responsibilities left, right, and centre. Women have busy lives, so actually physical activity levels often go down in 40s and 50s. So weight gain is common during the menopausal transition. Musculoskeletal joint pains, really common. Vaginal dryness, recurrent urinary tract infections. Sexual dysfunction, so decreased libido, very, very common. And of course, something we're really interested in my research group at the medical school, the kind of the vasomotor symptoms, the brain fog, the difficulty in concentration, difficulty in attention, maybe some memory difficulties, particularly verbal fluency and verbal memory. And just a general increase in mood and anxiety, very, very typical during the menopause. So it doesn't look very pleasant, does it, when you see an anesthetic? And then there's also things like tendinitis and palpitations. Palpitations also are common. And there's this actual feeling of loss of self, that one doesn't recognize oneself anymore. So they're the kind of the short-term and acute effects. And of course, some of the things which menopause accelerates is our risk of things like cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, and dementia. So they're kind of some of the sort of the subchronic and the chronic effects of menopause. And as I say, an area we're really interested in is this brain fog phenotype. And actually, again, you can kind of see why this happens. So when you look at areas of the brain like the frontal cortex, so the frontal cortex is really important for working memory, and it's really important for executive function. So executive function is things like our ability to manipulate tasks, our ability to accumulate information, to synthesize ideas, our inhibitions, just information processing and idea synthesizing is very affected by the frontal cortex. Things like the hippocampus and the amygdala are really important for information processing, for short-term memory, for verbal memory, for episodic memory. And you can see that all these areas are laden with estrogen receptors and are very responsive to estrogen. So it kind of makes physiological sense that these kinds of things are going to be affected as we transition through the menopause. A really interesting question we have is, if you suffer from these things really significantly during the menopausal transition, does this increase your lifelong risk of dementia? And we don't know the answer to that. Maybe in 10 years' time I'll come back and I might be able to tell you something, but that's a very, very unknown question at the moment. Now, we did actually a survey locally, which has kind of informed some of our grant applications which are going in at the moment, just to ask local women what their experience of the menopause was. And I just want to bring up just one slide of the results of that survey. And I don't know if you can read that. You hopefully will be able to. But many described not recognizing themselves for a period of time, either mentally, physically, or both, fearing they had gone mad or had dementia. Women impact on close relationships. Women described the impact that the menopausal transition had on their wider family network, often leading to constantly apologizing to partners or children, with some fearing that it could result in losing their husband and children. Things like feeling like we're going mad, feeling like a liar, falling to pieces, feel awful about their bodies, struggling to lose weight. These are kind of things I think that are really, really commonly reported. So that's kind of the bad news out of the way. The good news is there's plenty we can do to make a difference. And you know, what I'm going to go on to now is what interventions or what we can do on a day-to-day basis that may make the menopausal transition less symptomatic. Actually, a lot of what I'm going to tell you is inferring rather than actually research-based, because there is a relatively small amount of research that has been currently done in women during the perimenopausal transition. We do know the metabolic effect of the menopause, and we do know the physiological processes that kind of underlie some of these changes. So we get an increase in inflammation in the body, we have a dysregulated glucose metabolism, we have an increase in cardiovascular risk and vascular dysfunction, and we kind of know a lot at this stage about what nutrition approaches could target these things. So I'm going to go on now and just kind of describe some of those to you in the hope that you'll find it informative. And this is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about the minefield, which is HRT. I'm going to talk about phytoestrogens and isoflavones, supplements. I'm not a big fan of supplements, but they are useful in certain circumstances. And then talk about some of the nutrition approaches that we and others have been working on. So hormone replacement therapy. So you can, as part of hormone replacement therapy, get estrogen only. Estrogen only is only suitable for women who don't have a uterus. So if you have had a hysterectomy, you can't take estrogen only. And the reason for that is if you take estrogen only and you have a uterus, it will cause an increase or swelling of the lining of your uterus, which could eventually increase your risk of cancer of the uterus. So for the majority of people who haven't had a hysterectomy and have a functional uterus, the combination of estrogen and progesterone is prescribed. Testosterone isn't available in the NHS at the moment. In certain circumstances it is, but it's not routinely prescribed. So when we talk about estrogen and progesterone, they can be either natural or synthetic, but I have to say these days it's mainly the natural forms that are used, and the natural forms are almost identical to the types our bodies produce. And they can be given as oral, through the skin, so either as patches or gel, or vaginally. And the choice of those is down to the preference of the woman, but also down to the health status of the woman. And I'll kind of describe in a minute what the thinking goes into the choice of whether you have oral, transdermal, or vaginal. When is HRT not recommended? So HRT isn't for everybody. It's down to the choice of the woman, but also the National Institute for Health and Social Care, NICE, which kind of supports the NHS, recommends that for women who've had breast cancer or other estrogen-dependent cancers, untreated endometrial hyperplasia, that's kind of an inflammation of the lining of your uterus, thromboembolism, so either deep vein thrombosis or who've had a blood clot in the lung, or any kind of blood clotting disorder. If you've had a previous cardiovascular event or you suffer from liver disease, then generally HRT is not recommended. For people who are at high risk of these conditions, also HRT is prescribed with caution. Also HRT is prescribed with caution if you're diabetic or you tend to suffer from migraines. Now, when it comes to the choice of whether you have tablet or transdermal, or you have a patch, for people who are at risk of blood clotting or who are at risk of stroke, the usual recommendation is you have a patch rather than take a pill. And the reason is if you take a pill, it stimulates blood clotting in the liver. Whereas if you have the estrogen as a patch, it doesn't have the same effect. So anybody who's slightly above average risk of a blood clot or a stroke, the patch is better than the pill. Now, this was the plague of the HRT world, and we've been battling against the results of this study ever since. This was the study which was published in 2002, and it was called the Women's Health Initiative Study. It was a huge undertaking, a decade's worth of work in the US, conducted in 40 centres. They had loads of interventions, but 2 of the interventions were HRT. And there was one study that involved 17,000 women, half were on a control, half were on HRT, which was a combination of estrogen and progesterone, the synthetic form. Most of the women in the study were 60 years plus. So it certainly wasn't in perimenopause or early postmenopause. The study was meant to be 8 years. It was stopped after 5 years because it was found that it was increasing women's risk of breast cancer. And that threw the whole field of HRT into disarray and suddenly got everybody worried. Now, the reality is that HRT has a minuscule risk of increasing the risk of breast cancer in regular individuals who haven't had breast cancer. And that actually it's the progestogen, so you take estrogen and progesterone, it's the progestogen which increases your risk of breast cancer only if you take it for longer than 5 years and only if you take it later in life. So if you go on to HRT during the perimenopausal period or early postmenopausal period, then the effect on breast cancer is negligible. And this kind of shows it graphically. This is a really nice graphic actually produced by the British Menopause Society, and I'll talk us through it. So it looks at women between the ages of 50 to 59 and how many will develop breast cancer per 1,000 in the next 5 years. And you can see in the general population, 23 women will develop breast cancer per 1,000 in the next 5 years. If you're on HRT, that goes up to 27 per 1,000. So instead of being 23 per 1,000, it's 27 per 1,000 if you're on HRT for a long time. If you're on estrogen only, there's no increase in breast cancer. If you've ever been on the contraceptive pill in your life, your risk is also 27. So it's the same as having been on contraceptive pill. If you like a tipple and take more than 2 units of alcohol a night, that also increases your risk of breast cancer to the same level as being on HRT. If you're a smoker, the same. And actually, if you're overweight or obese, you can see it results in a massive increase in your breast cancer risk. So I guess what I'm trying to show by this graphic is that the effects of HRT are minuscule on your breast cancer risk and are equivalent to things like being a regular drinker and being overweight. So I would say that the benefits, if you're a person who's willing to take HRT, the benefits far outweigh the risk. The benefits of HRT on vasomotor symptoms, such as hot flushes and night sweats, have been proved beyond reasonable doubt. This is the Cochrane Review, gold standard in the field. 21 studies involving 2,200 people, a 77% reduction in hot flush frequency, 87% reduction in symptom severity, and they concluded that HRT is highly effective in elevating hot flushes and night sweats. So certainly proved beyond reasonable doubt. As we transition from premenopause to postmenopause, so between the ages of about 41 to 60, as women we lose about 25% of our bone. We lose it at a rate of about 2% in our spine per year as we transition to the menopause. And in our femur, the top of our femur, we lose about 1% per year. HRT, taken before the age of 60, is extremely effective at reducing the risk of osteoporosis and reducing the rate of bone loss. Also, before the age of 60, HRT will reduce our lifelong risk of cardiovascular disease. We've been quite interested in HRT and cognition and long-term dementia risk and this brain fog phenotype. Because as I said earlier, the brain is very responsive to estrogen, particularly areas of the brain which modulate cognition, our ability to think, such as the hippocampus. The amygdala is an area which really modulates our emotions, our mood and anxiety. The hippocampus, the entorhinal and the frontal cortex, really important areas of the brain for cognition. So we were quite interested if there was any evidence that HRT would modulate these effects. One of the reasons we were quite interested is because 2/3 of dementia sufferers are women. And that's not just because we live longer. Age-standardized dementia rates are higher in women than men. So we've been quite interested to see if, brain fog during the menopausal transition, could that affect our lifetime risk of dementia, and can HRT help? So yeah, this slide here just shows the age-standardized dementia rates. So the one on the right is the number of people suffering from dementia at various ages in the population as a whole. The orange bubbles are female and the green bubbles are male. So you can see at every age there's more people with dementia who are female compared to male. So we were quite interested in looking at this in the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease cohort. So this is a cohort, there's 30 centres around Europe, 9 countries, 10 of those centres are in the UK. In this particular analysis, we included 1,178 women who had been on HRT for varying lengths of time. And what we found was that in women with the ApoE4 gene, which makes you at higher risk of lifetime risk of dementia, about 25% of the population, we found that E4 women got cognitive benefits from HRT, so much improved memory in HRT users, particularly if you were the E4 genotype. Interestingly, we looked at volumes of particular areas of the brain, things like the hippocampus, the entorhinal cortex, the amygdala, areas of the brain which are really important for cognition, and we found those areas of the brain were 6 to 10% larger in women who were on HRT, particularly if you were ApoE4. And the really interesting final thing was that the earlier you started, the better. So the greatest benefit was seen in women who started HRT during the perimenopausal rather than late postmenopausal period. So this has kind of set us on in all kinds of directions looking at this in more detail. We got a lot of media attention for this, and a lot of people were very grateful because it was around the time when Meghan and Harry were all over the newspapers and we pushed them off the front pages for a day, which was quite handy. And many of you might know this already, but if you're interested in taking HRT, you can pay £19.20 a year, and you can get your HRT prescriptions for the whole year for £19.20. So it's about two months' worth of prescription. So it's called the HRT Prepayment Certificate, the PPC. So I'll now move on to alternatives. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is isoflavones, which are natural plant estrogens. So they're estrogens, they're estrogen mimics, but they're present in plants. And these are the kind of foods they're present in. So the most common form of phytoestrogens are things called isoflavones. And isoflavones are found in foods like soya products, so edamame, tofu, soya milk, all those kinds of things. And they're also found to a lesser degree in flax seeds and red clover. Isoflavone consumption in places like South Asia, China, and Japan tend to be about 50 to 70 milligrams per day. We're not great soya consumers in this country. We consume less than 1 milligram of isoflavones per day. The incidence of hot flushes and night sweats is significantly lower in Asian countries. And one of the reasons is thought to be due to the relatively high consumption of isoflavones. Now, isoflavones are dateine and genistein and equol. It's quite hard in our Western diet to eat enough soya. You'd need to eat about 15 to 20 grams of soya protein a day to get 50 milligrams of isoflavones. That's the kind of dose you need to be taking. So this is one incidence when I would say go for supplements if you're interested in taking isoflavones. And actually the evidence is a bit mixed, but it does seem to be many women get benefits from taking isoflavones. It seems to be actually down to the composition of your gut microbiome, whether you're responsive or not, but a lot of women gain benefit from isoflavones. There's all kinds of other supplements, but like black cohosh, sage, ginseng, evening primrose oil, St. John's wort, all of these kinds of things. There's been about 500 clinical trials, but I have to say the evidence is very mixed, and I couldn't recommend any of them to you at this stage. Isoflavones, I think, is the only supplement where there's good evidence that they might be beneficial in some. And I would recommend some Zoe podcasts on this topic if you're interested in kind of getting up to speed. So moving on to kind of dietary approaches. As we mentioned earlier, night sweats and hot flushes are really common. Things like hot beverages, caffeine, alcohol, and spicy foods, try and get your consumption of those down. They really help with the hot flushes and night sweats. I'm a devil for spicy foods. It's very hard for me to stay away from them. But so yeah, there are simple things we can do. Mediterranean diet. When we look at the things like inflammation, glucose dysregulation, vascular dysfunction, a Mediterranean diet contains all the bioactives that will help mitigate some of those physiological effects. A Mediterranean diet is very aligned with a healthy UK diet, but what it will be described, a Mediterranean diet is described as having whole plant foods as part of every meal. So a high consumption of fruits, veg, whole grains, beans, nuts, legumes, things like that. Olive oil tends to be the culinary oil used in cooking in Mediterranean countries. Fish and seafood consumed 2 or 3 times a week. And things like meats, especially red processed meats, and discretionary foods, confectionaries, consumed in moderation. Salt is rarely used in a traditional Mediterranean diet. Herbs and spices, not salt. And of course, red wine tends to be the alcoholic beverage of choice and drunk in moderation. You can look for yourself how you're doing. This is a typical scoring system we use in our group. If you tick each one of those, you've got the perfect score. The average score in the UK is about 6. And I think that's people being generous to themselves, to be honest. So you can kind of see the kind of things that are included in the Mediterranean diet. The important thing is changing even one thing will make a difference. So you do not need the perfect diet to make a difference. There is emerging evidence that the Mediterranean diet can help menopausal symptoms, it can help with weight management, it can help with osteoporosis risk, and it can help with cardiometabolic syndromes. We've been very interested in its cognitive benefits. And I'll present to you one study. We've just got the data through. It just finished in January, and we just unblinded the study last week. So I have the first data available, which is nice to be able to show you. And we were asking the question, can the Mediterranean diet make a difference in the short term? This was called the MediMood study. And the question we asked is, what are the postprandial? Postprandial is after you eat, immediately after you eat. What are the postprandial and short-term effects of a Mediterranean-style diet on mental health and cognition in people with mild to moderate anxiety and depression, i.e. menopausal, even though it wasn't specifically in menopausal women? And these were our aims. Our primary outcome was mood and anxiety. And then we had a whole host of secondary outcomes, things like cognitive performance, blood flow to the brain, the gut microbiome. We had a sneaky feeling that the gut microbiome could change very quickly, even though nobody's looked at it. So we wanted to see, could we shift it in 5 days? And also all kinds of markers of cardiovascular and cognitive health. What we did is we provided everybody with a supermarket delivery, so they had all their foods for 5 days, and they had careful instructions what to do with it. People were on the perfect Mediterranean diet for 5 days versus the worst Western diet for 5 days. And the ethics committee would only allow us to do it for 5 days. They said longer than 5 days was cruel. Even though the diet is not an atypical diet, it was a diet that's consumed by many in the population. And it was a crossover, so everybody did both arms. This just gives you an example of one of the days. This was day 4 on the Mediterranean diet. People had a very nice breakfast of Greek yogurt and blueberries, baked potato and tuna salad for lunch, grilled chicken, Mediterranean vegetables for tea. The Western diet didn't look so rosy. It was a fried breakfast, canned soup with white bread and then spaghetti carbonara for tea and plenty of biscuits and chocolate throughout the day. So this is the kind of diet we were comparing for 5 days. And I'll just show you one thing. So this is a composite measure of mood disturbance, a composite measure of mood and anxiety. You can see people's data at baseline. You can see by 24 hours the diets weren't making much of a difference. But look what happened even after 5 days. People's mood and anxiety had gone down by 40% on the Western diet, whereas as we expected, it started to creep up on the Western diet. And actually, this is a composite score, and it's made up of all of these things. And tension was less, depression was less, anger was the same, vigor, energy. It wasn't too high to begin with. Vigor or energy was increased, fatigue was down, confusion was down, just over the course of 5 days. And actually, this is kind of a bit complicated. This presents the gut microbiome. Actually, these figures probably aren't fit for purpose, but I had to do them quickly. What we did show was that the speciation, the types of bacteria in our gut, were already improved by 5 days. And actually, this shows the metabolism of bacteria in our gut, how the bacteria metabolize beta diversity, their metabolic profile. We didn't see anything on day 1, but by day 6, we had shown a significant effect of intervention in the gut microbiome. Now, these were quite extremes of diet, but we just wanted to show that it really makes a difference even in the short term. But I think even if we had much more gradual differences in diet, we'd still have seen quite a meaningful effect on mood and anxiety, which I guess is the next stage for us. Why are we interested in the gut microbiome? Well, the gut microbiome is very associated with the brain, what's called the gut-brain axis. You might often have felt this sort of gut feeling or gut instinct. When you're disappointed, you feel gutted. You feel like you've had a kick in the stomach. There's a lot of connectivity between your gut and your brain. And this kind of happens at all kinds of levels. There's a direct nervous system connection between the gut is the only organ in the body, apart from the brain, which has a nervous system. And also there's a whole range of compounds produced by the gut, inflammatory markers, factors which affect our immune system, neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are actually the chemicals produced in our brain, which connects different areas of our brain. They're also produced. There's about 30 of them produced by the gut. So actually, there's a lot of connectivity between the gut and the brain. So I think if we can improve our gut health, it will certainly improve things like brain fog and cognition. And actually, one of the ways to do that is by consumption of whole grains. So I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of whole grains, but a whole grain is, as the name suggests, you eat the grain in its whole form. So an example of a whole grain is brown rice, whole wheat bread, whole oats, quinoa, things like that, bulgur wheat or cracked wheat. So that is a whole grain. Once the grain is completely processed, all you're left with is the white bit in the middle, the endosperm. If you consume things like white bread or white rice or white pasta, the endosperm, the good bits of the grain have been removed and you're just left with the endosperm, the starchy bit, the glucose-rich bit. And what happens when you consume whole grains is the glucose is released very slowly in the digestive system and absorbed into the bloodstream very slowly. If you consume refined carbohydrates, things like white bread, white rice, white pasta, crackers, sugars, things like that, you get these sugar peaks and troughs, which is very detrimental to well-being. So actually, whole grains are extremely important for general well-being, but they're very important for microbiome well-being. And it's particularly due also to their fiber levels. And particularly fermentable fibers. So fermentable fibers are very good for your gut bacteria. So things like inulin, beta-glucan, pectin, oligosaccharides, these kind of components, these kind of fiber components really enhance the functionality of your gut microbiome. And you can see for yourself what kind of foods they're present in, but whole grains are a really good source. So oats, brown rice, things like that. And actually, this is just quite a simple hack which I sometimes use about how to choose a good breakfast cereal, because fibre can be a really good source, or breakfast cereal can be a really good source of fibre. And what you do is you look at the total carbohydrate to fibre ratio, and if that's less than 10, then that's a good quality breakfast cereal. So you can see here the carbohydrate is 66, the fibre is 11. That's a ratio of about 6, so that's well and truly less than 10. So that's a good breakfast cereal. And for bread, the ratio should be less than 6. So that's kind of a good way of judging. Fish, I've been working on omega-3 and omega-3 fatty acids for a very long time. And I think it is not just a fishy tale. There are a lot of health benefits to omega-3 fatty acids, particularly for brain health. So brain tissue is very enriched in omega-3 fatty acids, which you find in oily fish. So there's 2 omega-3 fatty acids in oily fish. There's eicosapentaenoic acid or docosahexaenoic acid. When you look at most organs in the body, they contain less than 5% of the omega-3 DHA. But look at the brain. The brain contains about 15% of the omega-3 fatty acids. It's extremely important for brain health. And when you look at the synaptic regions where the neurons speak to each other, that contains up to 40% DHA. So incredibly important for brain health. We found, this is some of our research we published a few years ago now. We found as women age, the levels of DHA in the brain decline, particularly if you've got this risky ApoE4 genotype. And the decline seems to be more significant in women than it is in men as we age. Interestingly, what we also did was we have a model of human menopause in rodents. So we induce menopause in rodents and we look at different functionalities of the brain. And what we found is when you induce menopause in rodents, you really get a decline in omega-3 levels in the brain. So it seems to be that the omega-3 DHA is really important for brain health, but the decline is really rapid during the menopausal transition. And likely to be in humans as well. So I think likely to be really important to optimize our omega-3 intake during the menopausal transition. There are 2 kinds of omega-3s. They're the long chain ones which you find in oily fish, and there's the shorter chain one which you find in plants. Some products claim to be rich in omega-3, but it's often this one. So actually, don't be fooled by products that say they're rich in omega-3. It's the types of omega-3 you find in oily fish which are the ones that are really beneficial to brain health. And there are vegan supplement alternatives if you're not an oily fish consumer or you're vegan or vegetarian. I have to say, this is just tongue-in-cheek. We're not great consumers of oily fish in the UK. This is a picture I took in Lisbon Airport last year when I was coming back from a conference, and look at the beautiful display of all these cans of oily fish and duty-free, which looked extremely appealing, and I bought plenty of them. And this is what they look like. This was Heathrow. we as a population are not big oily fish consumers. We can do better, and I think the impact on our health would be significant if we could do better. I'm kind of coming to a close, just to say, this is a bit complicated, but just to say inflammation is incredibly important for all kinds of health outcomes. So you look at cardiovascular disease, depression, all of these conditions. There's many things which stimulate inflammation, things like infection, physical activity, carrying too much weight, poor diet. Actually, menopause really stimulates inflammation. So one of the things that is likely to really help is to consume foods which contain anti-inflammatory compounds. And of course, a Mediterranean diet, a plant-based diet, is very rich in anti-inflammatory compounds. And these are kind of some of the foods that fight inflammation. Some of the things that we've been talking about already. Things like fruits and vegetables, nuts, olive oil, green leafy vegetables, fatty fish. Very high in anti-inflammatory compounds, which are likely to help with some of the menopausal consequences. The opposite, foods that stimulate inflammation, are ultra-processed foods. 55% of our calories in the UK now come from ultra-processed foods. It is really the plague of modern times. Just to explain to you briefly, this is an apple. It's not processed in any way. This is apple juice. It only contains two things, apple juice and ascorbic acid. That would be called a mildly processed form of the apple. An ultra-processed form of the apple is when you contain it in an apple pie. And the health effects of the apple are very different in the two forms. This is how you spot an ultra-processed food. Long list of ingredients. A lot of them are unrecognizable, often very high in fat, sugar, and salt. If your fresh food has a long shelf life, I notice these days that bread lasts for about 3 weeks. That's because it's an ultra-processed food these days. And aggressive marketing and branding. All of these things are sure signs of an ultra-processed food. And actually, don't be fooled by the fact that something that sounds very healthy may not be very healthy. This was on Tim Spector's X account, Twitter account. Look at the lovely title, Vegan New York Deli Sandwich. Look at the list of ingredients. That is not a healthy option. So don't assume that something is plant-based, it equates to health, because it very much is not the case. Just to say, in addition to kind of our research, we try and get out and about. I've done a little bit of work with Saskia Harvey's help, who's here today, with kind of getting our research into government. So we do some work with the All Party Parliamentary Group on the menopause. They're kind of really making inroads in shifting government policy around the menopause. This is Carolyn Harris, who's the MP for Swansea East. She leads that parliamentary group, and she's very, very proactive indeed. We've also tried to get involved a little bit in kind of sort of menopause in the workplace, and how we can support us better in the workplace. With menopause in mind. And there is some very, very good guidance which is now coming to fruition, which is really helping in that. I'll just finish by saying menopause affects all of us. It affects all of us, and we need to do better. For HRT, the benefits outweigh the risk for almost everyone, but not for some. But it is a personal choice. There's lots of other options. Interventions in the perimenopause are likely to be most effective. Start early. You know, don't wait till you're well through the menopause to start thinking about these things. Increasing your Mediterranean diet score by even 1 to 2 points is likely to be associated. Take care. Minimize your sugar. Minimize your refined carbohydrate. And the important thing is we don't need the perfect diet. The effects of diet health is very sensitive to diet. Every little helps. And actually, in workplaces, we all are in workplaces, we are all in positions where we can influence the well-being of others. Even modest initiatives can make a big difference. And I just have a couple of slides on that to finish off. For those of us who are women and in the workplace and suffering from menopausal symptoms, talk about it. Talking is knowledge, and knowledge is empowerment. Use the available resources. Think about flexible working hours. Avoid the triggers. So if you've got an important meeting or an important presentation coming up, don't have your spicy food or loads of caffeine or loads of hot beverages, because that will make a difference. Use technology to your advantage. The reality for many, for certain times during the menopause, is that our memory is poorer, our concentration is poorer. Use technological prompts, use lists, use note-taking, just work with it. UEA is doing a lot. UEA has come a long way in recent times, and we have a lot of really sort of proactive objectives around how to do better in our menopausal support. these are the kind of things which I'll leave up for you to read by yourself. These are the kind of things which have happened already if you're a UEA employee. And Anna Taylor is the UEA lead on menopausal support, and she would be glad to, she couldn't make it today, but she would be glad to hear from you if you have any questions at all. So I think I've spoke for long enough, and I'll leave it there.
Anne-Marie, that was amazing. Thank you very much indeed. Well, it was food for thought at the risk of cliche. Questions, anyone? Do you want me on? It does. I'm only comparing. It doesn't matter. Okay. Is that okay? Great. Questions, anyone? Sorry, do you mind waiting for the microphone?
Is this on? Yeah. Anne-Marie, you said there wasn't much clinical evidence to support some of the items that you showed here. Is there an initiative at UEA where we can volunteer or at least be in touch?
Yeah, I mean, we are starting to do those interventions, which we kind of advertise widely. So if you're kind of interested in being part of any of that, just drop me an email. And when anything comes up, we'll contact you immediately. Yeah, thank you.
Would be interested, thank you.
Up at the back there.
Anne-Marie, this has come from our online audience. Is it true that the new trend is to give hormones to women to prolong our period and delay the menopause?
I don't think that is common practice. So the question, sorry, could you repeat it? So,
yes, of course it's. Is it true that the new trend is to give hormones to women to prolong our period and delay the menopause?
I don't think that's common practice at all. Certainly not. There would be no nice, that kind of approach would not be good clinical practice.
Down here in the front.
I mean, I guess there might be one, that question might have come from maybe women who have had a medical menopause induced early. So what happens then is, because there's a recognition that if you have menopause before the age of 40, for example, the long-term health consequences of that early menopause might be quite significant. So in those instances, women are recommended to take HRT until the time they would have experienced the natural menopause, so up to about their early 50s. So it's not kind of delaying menopause itself, because menopause has already been induced, but it's kind of mitigating some of the health consequences of an early menopause. That might be where the question came from.
You're saying that whole grain is a good thing to have. Yeah. If you're grain intolerant, what would be a good alternative for that?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the gut bacteria, you mean? Yeah. So things like flavonoids. So flavonoids are kind of bioactives you find in fruits and vegetables. So particularly things like citrus fruits or berries, any kind of fruits or vegetables that are kind of purple in color. So red cabbage, red onion, berries are a really good source of flavonoids. Citrus fruits are really good sources of flavonoids. Teas are a really good source of flavonoids. Now, flavonoids have also been shown to really stimulate the gut bacteria and create a healthier profile. So when it comes to gut health, if grains are kind of off the table, then anything with flavonoids in. So if you look up the word flavonoids, or polyphenols is another word for them, but they tend to be in quite high concentrations in all kinds of fruits and vegetables. So they would be a good alternative.
Another online question.
And this question comes from Laura. Is there much evidence on how to wean off HRT? I have had patients in their 80s still on it.
Yes, I mean, some people like to stay on it because they think it's hugely beneficial to them and their well-being. I mean, I think common practice these days is that the benefits of taking HRT beyond the age of 60 are minimal. But of course, it is the patient's choice, and having that conversation with their clinician. And no two women have the same set of circumstances or the same health profile. So I think, you know, at a population level, there's probably no great benefit to us all staying on HRT till we're 80, but it could be for that individual. There are very good reasons why you're staying on HRT till the age of 80. So I think have that conversation with your clinician.
Just while the microphone's getting there, is that just a self-fulfilling prophecy because people say you should stop HRT when you're 60, do you think? Or has anybody actually done the study and asked what happens if you're in your 70s?
Yeah, I mean, I think the research has been done. It seems to be that for kind of long-term health, at least, sort of for cardiovascular risk and for osteoporosis risk, there's no extra benefit of staying it on long-term. It could be just for general well-being on a day-to-day basis. It might make some feel better acutely. So, yeah.
I'm quite interested in the cognitive research that you said was hot off the presses. Is there going to be any more presentations on your data? Will you be publishing? What are the next steps for those findings?
Oh, for the short-term study?
Correct.
Yeah. We're just going through to publication now. So, I mean, most nutrition research looks at the long-term health benefits of dietary change. Actually, some of the things that diet does can happen really quickly. So things like increasing blood flow to the brain, anti-inflammatory, increasing your gut microbiome, antioxidant effects. Actually, there's very little research on the acute effects or the subchronic effects of nutrition on health and well-being. And actually, for the most of us, you know, telling somebody in their 20s or even 40s that if you change your diet, it'll reduce your risk of osteoporosis when you're 80 is not terribly motivating. But actually, if you could say to somebody, actually, we have evidence that if you do this, that, and the other, you'll have more energy levels, you'll sleep better, lower mood and anxiety. You know, I think for most people, actually, the acute effects or the subchronic effects are really motivating and really important. But actually, the research in that space hasn't been done at all, and it's a huge lacking. So we're very much interested in kind of following that up. And kind of, we just took it to the extremes just to prove it made a difference. Now we need to just get much more nuanced and figure out exactly what matters in the short term.
Right in the middle there.
Hi, thanks for this. My understanding is that historically, menopause hasn't really been addressed in medical schools and in general practice. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but I think if you're fortunate enough to have a general practitioner or a menopause specialist nurse, or now there's a really brilliant Norfolk menopause clinic that is just illuminating. But I'm just wondering if you know whether in the medical training community, whether there is now more emphasis on training doctors to recognize symptoms and be able to talk with patients about what they can do.
I think you're spot on. I think traditionally it hasn't got enough focus at all. I think that is changing fast. The Women's Health Strategy was published last year or the year before, and there is kind of a huge focus on the need to have our healthcare professionals better equipped to deal with menopause. I think it is a lacking in our medical training, but I think and hope it's changing quickly. And actually, there does seem to be some GPs have, for whatever reason, got quite a in-depth knowledge, and some don't. I would say, you know, if your experience is with your GP that the GP is dismissive or doesn't seem to be particularly interested, then change your GP. Because, yeah, I think at the moment there is a huge difference in knowledge across the medical profession. But I think it's changing and improving quickly. Yeah.
Do you see right at the back there?
Hi, thanks, Anne-Marie. That was really fascinating, the breadth of what you were talking about. Could you talk more a little maybe about other ways of developing bone density if you don't take HRT?
Yeah.
Is there any evidence of things like exercise, weightlifting, that kind of stuff?
I mean, exercise, certainly, yeah. I mean, calcium and vitamin D, important for sure, and in combination. Because in order to accumulate calcium in your bones, you need vitamin D to metabolize it. So calcium and vitamin D combination. And yeah, weight-bearing exercise, yeah, is probably, you know, the other good thing you could be doing. So things that put pressure on your bones. So any kind of weight-bearing exercise, you know, in the gym, running, yeah. Actually, excess body weight is good for reducing bone loss, but not to be recommended.
Just as an extra to that as well, so if you weren't taking HRT, but because of other reasons, would that, how does it compare with the effectiveness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that direct comparison probably hasn't been made. Yeah, I mean, HRT is pretty effective if taken at the right time, but the combination of calcium, vitamin D, and weight-bearing exercise is pretty effective too, and I would say comparable. Yeah, it's not that one is like this and one is like this. They are quite comparable. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Question over here.
Thank you. You mentioned that some women get off a bit more lightly on some of these symptoms, and I wondered if you had any insight or prediction as to whether there's any genomic underpinning or genetic predisposition as to why that happens, or is it more likely that they just had that beneficial lifestyle, the right diet, and if that was 90% of it, sort of thing?
Do you know, it's really completely unknown. It's so understudied you wouldn't believe. I mean, we do very well describing the symptoms, but we do very badly in kind of trying to establish the etiology of those symptoms and predict who's likely to develop symptoms or who isn't likely to develop symptoms. So you're absolutely right. There's probably a genetic component. There's probably a huge lifestyle component, epigenetic component, all of those things, but it's so poorly understood you wouldn't believe. Yeah, it's a really under-researched area. The only thing we do know is that people who live with obesity tend to suffer from vasomotor symptoms more. So that is one thing that's pretty well established. But other than that, there's very little known.
Saskia.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Your research is endlessly fascinating and so needed. If you had to choose one or two things which would be your legacy from this research, what would you choose?
Oh my heavens, you're putting me on the spot now. I think just, I mean, what we're following up now, which I think is a really important question, is the impact of initiation at HRT at different time points and the effect that has. So we have some model systems at the moment where we're initiating HRT at exactly the same time as the menopause starts versus initiating HRT after the menopause has happened, to try and see the timing of HRT and how important that is. And I think that's something that there's a lot of confusion around, and that's something that I'd really like to kind of nail. The other thing is the kind of the brain fog and the anxiety. The mental health side of perimenopause, I think, is huge. And I think if we could help identify one or two dietary components or dietary strategies, I've named some today, but I think we can get more refined. You know, we need to do more research in that space. I would really like to be able to identify one or two really specific things from a dietary perspective that could help that sort of brain fog phenotype during the menopausal transition. Yeah, thank you.
But what do we know about the neuroscience of brain fog? What causes it?
Again, very poorly understood. I mean, estrogen does all kinds of things in areas like the hippocampus and the amygdala and the entorhinal, the frontal cortex. So it's involved in things like synaptic plasticity, it's involved in neurogenesis, it's involved in glucose utilization, it's involved in a kind of a whole host of physiological processes which are key to cognition. Which of those are more important than the other? So we kind of know what estrogen does, and we kind of know the areas of the brain it does it, but yeah, what interventions can kind of mitigate some of those losses of estrogen we know very little about.
So any other questions, anyone? Time for a final question? No, okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Okay, so thank you everyone for your really interesting questions and an incredibly thought-provoking talk and thought-provoking questions. So for those of you who are here now, you're very welcome to join us outside for a drinks reception. And could I also highlight to everybody that UEA will have a exhibit at the Norfolk show this summer where you can see further evidence of the wonderful work that we're doing here. But now it only remains for me to thank Anne-Marie for a truly wonderful and inspiring talk. Thank you very much.